Welcome to Game Over World Juniors. This is the last one, and I had a nice intro written out for all of the other hosts to do, and I'm so unfocused being home for the holidays with the kids that I have already forgotten it. But it's SDPN, it's Elite Prospects, it's EP Rinkside. We're together here today with David St. Louis and Lauren Kelly from Elite Prospects. I'm Andrew Berkshire. If you're here watching this one, obviously this show was tailor-made to focus on the Canadian team, but we're here for the gold medal game. If you're here, you're one of the hardcores. You're a nerd. You like prospects. You're a prospect nerd. That's why you're here. So we're going to give you exactly what you want, which is some in-depth conversation about these young children who just played some fantastic hockey in a game that was a lot closer, I think, than it looked by the scoreline. David, Lauren, we'll start with you, David. How did you find this game watching it? Did this tournament end the way it was supposed to?
Yeah, it was really fun. Actually, it was a pretty fun tournament overall. It's always fun, but I feel like this year it was a level above. The game had a lot of pace, a lot of breakdowns too, but some good defense. Like in terms of tactics, it was interesting. We saw a lot of first round prospects that we followed through the year. So it had all the right elements to make this really fun, honestly.
Lauren?
Yeah, and I think the way that this tournament ended, the two best teams going head to head for, a chance to win gold, and obviously the most stacked team on paper, at least heading into the tournament, ended up winning it. And, Sweden put up a good fight for their, first chance to try and win gold on home soil. So it was a really exciting game, a really exciting way to end what was a really great tournament.
Yeah, it was really fantastic. We had in the bronze medal game one of the greatest comebacks maybe in like international hockey history, pulled off by Czechia against Finland, and then you have this one where, like the scoreline looks bad, but I feel like for 50 minutes of this game or more, it was a really really tight, well fought game by both teams with very contrasting styles. Right, you look at the American lineup, and especially at forward, they essentially brought four scoring lines, right? Like I was noticed in the first period, one of my takeaways was I was looking at all these players and the way that they were playing, and I was like, they basically went into this tournament and were like, what if we bring William Nylander 9 times? And I don't mean that as like a knock on William Nylander, but a lot of those guys could kind of get lost in their own defensive zone, and you could tell that the Swedish forecheck was really getting to them. They locked it down crazily well in the third, but you could tell a lot of those guys were thinking offense first, and maybe the takeaway should be teams should think of that more often.
Yeah. And it was fun to watch because, like, yes, they both were great formations, but they used different tactics. I feel like like you said, the US was very offensive focused, and it was a lot of rush offense and creating breakdowns in the position and a high cycle, making some creative passes at the top of the zone. And the Swedish team had better defense, and they rely on that too. But it was mostly like when they couldn't break through, they would just dump the puck and cycle low in the zone. And I retweeted something about these two strategies being really opposed, and one is more old style and the other one is more new style. And I think it was fun to see that the more creative hockey won in the end, and that's really what's fun to watch, and what I like to watch and what most people want to watch, really. So we saw a lot of creative plays from the US team, but like you said, could have gone either way, really. It's just who was going to capitalize on the breakdowns the most, and I feel in the end it was the US team. They had superior talent, maybe just a slightly. And yeah, it was a really fun game, honestly, for the strategies, for the players who played. Really exciting.
Lauren, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with everything that David said. Like, so two very different teams who had pretty different paths to get here. Even though I think heading into the tournament, we thought Sweden was probably going to finish atop the group, and they still ended up doing that. But I don't think any of us expected them to lose to Finland in the round robin. And so, heading into this game, I was basically like, is the defense going to hold up against this like stacked superpower American team? And obviously we saw in this game there were large stretches of it where the American forwards were just beating the defenders down the wall, getting, rushes to the net. There were a lot more defensive breakdowns from Sweden than I thought we would see from them in this game. And I thought the Americans did a really good job of exposing them on the rush and in zone coverage as well. And I think that's why they ultimately ended up winning. I mean, they were just the better team at, capitalizing on, the little few lapses that their opponent had. And whereas, with Sweden, the Americans are definitely not perfect defensively, but they struggled to really create consistent offensive zone pressure. I mean, Trey Augustine did have to make a couple of big saves to keep the score the way it was, especially late in that third period before they kind of blew away at the end. But yeah, the Americans just did a much better job, I felt like, overall, of kind of capitalizing on their opponent's mistakes.
It seemed like, I mean, obviously there's less access to detailed analytics during a World Juniors tournament than there would be during NHL games. But just by the eye test, it seemed like to me, at least through the first 40 minutes, the last period, I feel like must have been heavily tilted towards the USA. But through the first 40, it felt like maybe Sweden had more scoring chances, but the USA had much higher quality scoring chances. And, you know, I feel like, I feel bad for for the Swedish goalie there, Havlid, but it does seem like he couldn't stand up to the quality of performance that Trey Augustine was giving either.
Yeah, honestly, both goalies are really good. So the quality of performance, there wasn't a big gap between these two, but a small gap at this level. Sometimes it's the difference between winning and losing. And he could have made some extra saves, but the shots he got that went in, they were pretty good shots, maybe except for the Ziv Bouillon shot that was pretty far away. But the rest of them, breakaways or passes in front, it was some pretty difficult saves for him. But yeah, I guess the US goalie really beat him in this matchup.
Yeah, and I
Well,
think, Havlid was, I guess, named the best goalie of the tournament, but
Yeah,
and today's game just was like, it's not a reflection of how his tournament, like, what played out. He was phenomenal in some of those games, especially against Canada, in the round robin, and then again in the semifinals against the Czechs. So, obviously not every goalie's gonna have a perfect game, and Augustine was just a little bit better tonight, but he has nothing to hang his hat on, or whatever that saying is. Like, he played really well tonight. Like,
he shouldn't hang his head, I think is what
yes,
you're going for.
there we go.
Yeah.
My brain is fried from the last 2 weeks. So
Yeah, and I know we always talk every year about how like this tournament isn't the thing that you should hang your hat on, Lauren, for prospect analysis, right? But I think for a lot of people who aren't familiar with prospects, this is the time when they get to see these players play back to back to back for the first time, right? Or for the most in their hockey watching season. So it can be dangerous to overanalyze these guys and like make rankings and all this based on a World Junior tournament. But I feel like it might be even more dangerous to do that for goaltenders. It seems like goaltenders can come into this tournament and be terrible and end up with fine NHL careers, or be absolutely unbeatable and never be heard from again. Where does Trey Augustine fit in that for you guys?
think it's another overall good performance for him. But like you said, it won't define his entire career. But those stages are always important to evaluate goaltenders to an extent, because you want to see their mental strength, their ability to step up in big games. But does that really matter in the end in your evaluation? Maybe it shouldn't, maybe it should, depending on the goalie. So like you said, goalies in general are very hard to evaluate. And you just like if it's a small sample size, it's even harder. You really have to watch them for years to really understand their game and how they might perform in the NHL. So you can't put too much weight on these games, but they're maybe a bit more important than your traditional regular season game.
Absolutely. But the question is, do people latch on to Trey Augustine's performance, or do they kind of shake their head at the sportsmanship at the end? Because I don't know I don't know you guys, but I feel like this game was like a microcosm of how exciting USA hockey is, and how also very difficult it is to ever root for them, because you're reminded very quickly that it's like a group of really like prep school kids, and they very much act like that. And I thought the crowd for this game in Sweden was absolutely phenomenal. You know, they were reactive to missed calls, of course, but they weren't mean spirited. They were singing, they were having a good time. So the egging on of the crowd at the end there, it didn't play super well for me. I know they're teenagers, but
Yeah, I think when you do this kind of scouting job for a while, you tend to root for individual players more than teams. So you watch this and you want to see certain players perform well and all of this. So I don't know. I didn't see that as much, but I'm not looking as much for that either. So I wouldn't necessarily know how to answer this question. But yes, they played with the crowd. I thought it was fun at times and maybe a bit over the line in other times, but it won't matter in the end, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm less bothered by, you know, the Ryan Leonard hype up, like, are you here? I can't hear you, Sully, at the end of the game than I am. I think Cutter Gauthier was the one who cross-checked one of the Swedes that
Yep.
sparked that entire scrum with 30 seconds left. At that point, you're up by 4. You may, like, I understand adrenaline's running high, and so are your emotions. You know you're going to win. Do you really need to be beating down on your opponent? I mean, obviously, it led to the most impressive fight I've ever seen Lane Hudson have, but so I mean, I guess if he doesn't do that, we don't get to see that side of Lane Hudson. But at that point, I was more bothered, not necessarily bothered by it. It was just at a point like, do you really need to be doing this with 30 seconds left in the game? Kind of delayed the inevitable, I guess. And then obviously, you know, if you're the Swedish players, you can't just allow the US players to bully you in your own building. So there was one of those cases where, yeah, they're teenagers, emotions are running high. It is what it is. I'm not too bothered by the over aggressive Sullys, I guess, at the end.
Yeah, and we should say Canada does that stuff too, and it's still not. It doesn't leave the best taste in your mouth. Like the Cutter Gauthier thing at the end was pretty gross. Like as you mentioned, Lauren, they were already celebrating. You know, like they knew that it was over, right? So it's just unnecessary. Which it kind of sucks to have that because it's such a great moment for USA hockey, and then you kind of have to sit with that in your mouth too. Like it's just like you're chewing something and it's a good meal, but there's a little bit of dirt in it.
Yeah. I was going to say, I wonder if Arbor Jacki watched that fight and was getting worried for his spot in the lineup because he's really needed now that Lane Hudson can fight.
It's funny. I was watching Habs fans on Twitter react to that, and they were like, "Don't injure Lane Hudson!" Like they're mad at Cutter Gauthier for starting it.
The man is like bleeding profusely, like multiple times in this game. I think he's already as injured as it's gonna get.
Yeah, and obviously he was a big standout in terms of like overall play for USA, even if he wasn't a top end scorer overall in this tournament. Let's get into some individual performances, but before I do, I have to remind everybody watching, please like the stream, whether you're watching live or on replay. We love you all. It really means a lot to us that you come in and tune in. And if you're listening on wherever you can get your podcasts, you know, you can run on back to YouTube and like us there. You can leave a review or a rating. Tell us how much you love us, or hey, something we need to improve on. Who knows? It doesn't matter. All criticism is good as long as it's coming from a good place. Then let's go into some individual performances. We'll start with Lane Hudson because obviously with me hosting, there's going to be some Canadians fans here. I've got some regulars in the chat already. So let's start with him. Not the highest scoring tournament for Lane Hudson. Similar thing as last year, but overall, I feel like his role was wildly different than last season.
Yeah, and it was good to see him play in a different role, exactly, like see more of his defensive game, his ability to contain the rush and play in a lesser offensive role, because in this team he gets all the pucks, like he has all the ice time, all the pucks. He can play hero hockey, he can play any brand of hockey that he really wants. This time he had to adapt his game to a new role, and that's what he's going to have to do in the NHL too. So it's good that we got to see that from him, and he performed well overall. Like maybe his points weren't as flashy, they were more breakout passes or simple puck distribution on the power play, but he also had his moments, like the give and go he made in the earlier game where he just ran in the offensive zone, passed the puck back to someone, got it back below the goal line and fed it in front. So he adds those highlights, and he played pretty consistently good after the first couple of games when he got more ice time, like he's used to. So I think he performed well in every facet of the game. Maybe the rush defense was a bit harder at times. It's always the skating with him. It's good. It's not amazing. So was he always able to absorb rushes and all of this? I think he missed some of them. He contained some others. So the defensive game was a positive, I think, overall. Not a big positive, but a positive. And that's good for his development and what we want from him going forward, because we know he has offense. Is he going to be able to defend in the NHL? The question remains a bit.
Yeah, it is, and it is a question. It's a fair question, right? I think there's more to draw from this tournament in terms of his total NHL contribution. Like there's a lot more positives than if he would have just come in here and scored like 15 points and been used as a power play third pairing guy, right? Played over 27 minutes tonight. Huge minute eater for the USA down the stretch. Big tournament, I think, for Lane Hudson as a hockey player.
Yes, definitely. I think it was a stepping stone for him. Like it's something different. You want players to play in multiple environments, and it's just going to help him. We'll see where he is next year, but I think it's just going to help him in his development.
Absolutely. All right, Lauren, who was your biggest standout for the tournament overall?
Oh, that is a good question. Yeah, like honestly, I think I mean the obvious couple of ones are Gavin Brindley. The first time really for me to see his, I guess, goal scoring ability up close. He is small player, super speedy, undersized, but he doesn't play that way. I was super impressed by him and his ability to get down low, work along the boards, kind of hardest working player consistently. I really liked Rucker McGroarty in this tournament throughout, just super consistent and so impressive the way he played at this tournament, given that he was battling a pretty serious injury heading into this tournament. We weren't even sure if he was going to end up playing. And then I think the other guy, Jonathan Lekaramaki, and his shot is just lethal. So I was impressed to see, I guess, just guys that I don't normally get to see on a regular basis being so dialed in on the OHL during the year.
Yeah, he was really good, honestly. And for me, there was a bunch. I could talk about many different players. There was first Macklin Celebrini. I think we got to see the best of his game in many of his shifts, like the dynamic skills and the way he can take over shifts and create in defensive zone and get inside lane with his skating. So I think when I last talked to Mitch Brown, he was still the leader in game score in the overall tournament. So we track advanced stats, not we, I should say, Lassie and Mitch track advanced stats throughout the whole tournament, and he was still the leader in offensive zone entries and exits and creating defensive zone. So despite not playing the last few games, there was Lane Hudson and Zeev Boyum on as a draft eligible. I think he really stood out. He scored some pretty big goals, and I had some nice passing plays too. We saw his offensive game and how he could handle himself defensively too. He has a pretty complete game. We'll see about the skating. Some people think it's really like high and elite. I think it's more average. So we'll see how it affects his draft stock going forward. There was a bunch of other. You talk about Lekimaki, his shot a lot. Not sure about the whole 5-on-5 game. I'm not as much of a believer in Lekimari's game as others, but the shot is elite. Like you can't deny it. It's almost thematic on the power play. Mr. Cutter Gauthier too had a pretty detailed tournament, like offensively, defensively, was everywhere. There's really a bunch of great performances in this tournament.
Yeah, it's been a fantastic tournament overall. How much of the future can you see in Vancouver for Elias Pettersson? Like, how big of a part of that team is he going to be? Because it seems like having two of those would be good. Two Elias Petterssons, you know, like it just seems like it wouldn't be bad. There's no way you could ruin that, right? Unless he decides not to sign.
It seems really destined to happen. Like if you draft someone with the same name, you want him to play on the same team just for the fun of it. But he's really more shutdown defenseman. Like he has that physical side. He can absorb rushes. You always need these kinds of players, but they need some distinctive element, something that separates them from other defensemen who can do that. And he has the size, enough mobility, I think. I haven't watched him as much as others on our team, but I like his tournament overall. Pretty quiet performance, but he was solid and at the right place at the right time. As long as he can improve his off-puck defense, so really making sure that he maps out the ice in the defensive zone and not forget anyone behind him when he's not directly acting on a puck area. As long as he develops that, I think he will have a role in the NHL, and we'll see someone attempt to cast a game having both Elias Pettersson in the same game.
Yeah, and I think like definitely at this tournament, he's a lot more violent than I thought he was. Like throwing the body around for sure. But I think if you look at the grand scheme of Vancouver's blue line, like you got Quinn Hughes and like Hunter Brustevich is gonna move up, and like these are guys that are offense first, and so you kind of need a guy like Elias Pettersson on your blue line who's kind of that shutdown guy, the big physical presence, and I'm sure he'll carve out a role successfully in that organization, and it seems like they're really high on him.
It has to 100%.
Happen. Yeah, and just for your guys' information, it seems like YouTube is having an issue and we're just like frozen there. Oh, no. But we're gonna keep going because this is recording, and I'll put it up as a video afterwards. All it's doing is like our faces are frozen, and then every once in a while it shows an ad. So thanks YouTube, very helpful. Love that for a live show. I know it's not my internet because I've checked it. I've got it open. It's strong enough. It's much more strong than it needs to be. Trying to think of what else I had. How many? No. Here's a good one. Lauren, Zeev Boyum. how big of a tournament has this been for opening people's eyes for him? Because I've seen a lot of scouts talking about how much he's moved up the rankings. Obviously, you can't do it all in one tournament, but it seems like it's been a building story throughout the year.
Yeah, and I think though my philosophy with like smaller tournaments like World Juniors, like the Holinka, is that it can't necessarily hurt your draft stock too much. But if you have a really good tournament, then your draft stock can just start climbing. And I think that's exactly what Boehm has done in this tournament. I mean, he was a guy that I wasn't really sure what we were going to expect to see from him heading into this tournament, what kind of role they would give him, would he be shining offensively? And I think he really proved that, on the world stage that he's a guy that you can count on in big moments to step up with the big goal or to neutralize the rush. Pretty impressive tournament overall. I mean, like I don't know when we meet next to rank do our next board or whatever, where he'll end up falling on that ranking, or landing on that ranking. Falling is not the right word. I'm sure he'll be right up there with the top of D-men in this class. But yeah, it's just definitely a big tournament for him. I thought he was consistently, like aside from Celebrini, I thought maybe he looked like one of the best draft eligibles at this tournament, which is pretty impressive considering.
Yeah, he's probably going to be in our top 10. I can call it. Like if I compare his performance, not just at this tournament, but since over the past few months to other defensemen we have high, I think he's beating them in a bunch of categories, and he's just the upside is pretty great. He has some limitations. I talked about him before, but he's getting pretty interesting. I can put it like this.
Yeah, it seems like he's a guy who's going to turn a lot of heads. Rucker McGroarty, I know there's a lot of Jets fans that are really high on him. There's no way you can have a name like that and not be a natural born leader, right?
Yeah, he had a really good. I don't know. I didn't spot him that much in this game, but he had a pretty big hit on Sorum. I saw that. Like everyone in the arena saw that. I watched him over the rest of the games in the tournament, and he's still the skating is getting better. But that's really the main weakness in this game. But the rest of his game, it's everything is there. Like he can make plays, he can work the boards, he has that kind of shot. He's very good at positioning himself too. It's just, will he have the mobility to play his game in the NHL? I think more and more the answer is yes. And we didn't really see it with him as much as the Jets went in his draft year, but more and more, I think they were right to select him around where they did. Like it was really his right spot, considering the skill and what he can bring in a game and the leadership element. Not sure how to really quantify it, but he's been given the C and A's everywhere. So I think it's pretty big a testament that he's a born leader.
Yeah, Lauren. It was a pretty quiet tournament until this game, respectively to what he's done with his line in other tournaments throughout his, how many years now with the other guys from the U.S. development program. But Ryan Leonard stick the fork in it at the end there with an absolutely astonishingly good goal, fighting off checks like crazy. Where do you see him coming out of this tournament?
Yeah, I think Smith and Perreault obviously get a lot more attention. I think they found each other on several goals throughout this tournament, like way more. Like Leonard, I think is kind of like the third man on that line sometimes, but he had a tremendous tournament. I thought he was basically doing everything at one point besides landing his name on the score sheet. And even then, I think he still put up a ton of points. So this is a player that is physically imposing, plays that kind of like dog on a bone style of game where it's like if you are in a one-on-one race or battle for the puck with this guy, you're probably going to lose it because he is just that determined to get it back from you. And it's just a really kind of punctuation mark, that 5-2 goal on his tournament, where he seems to rise to the occasion. The higher the stakes get, the better he plays. And he scored a really big goal against he scored the overtime winner against Sweden at the U18s too, I believe, earlier this year or last year. So this is a guy who just loves to show up for big moments, but he's for the rest of the game, he's doing all the little things well. The off puck positioning, the reads, this is a really, really good player, and Caps fans should be very excited.
Yeah, it was about as much of a Ryan Leonard goal as it could be, right? It came a shift or two after running the goalie, and then when a Swedish defenseman started to get in his face, he very clearly dove backward trying to draw a penalty, and then he just outmuscles everybody, and his celly is igniting the crowd as well. Like that span of a few minutes really summed up who he is as a hockey player and why he's such an exciting prospect, because he doesn't even need to score like he's scoring in the World Juniors to be a very big factor in the NHL. Just the agitation alone, the number of penalties that he's going to draw in retaliations, it's going to be crazy. Like, people get upset about Matthew Tkachuk. I could see Ryan Leonard being like Matthew Tkachuk agitator on something else.
Yeah, that's who he models his game after. So
Not
definitely,
surprising.
yeah, the Caps really just have Tom Wilson 2.0 in their system.
Oh my God. Not again. Not again. And Ovi will still be there scoring. But yeah, it was such a great tournament with so many different styles of player standouts. And I think that's what's so special about this tournament is, yeah, it's a little bit more loose defensively because it's junior hockey than the NHL. But because of that, we're able to see like some of the coolest stuff that the most talented young players can do. And that's what makes me excited about this tournament every year and why I come back to it every year. Why I'm watching Sweden versus USA right now instead of just sticking to Canada, right? It's like the whole tournament has something for everyone. Um, Moving on, we should talk about Canada a little bit because, that we're Canadian. This is a Canadian network, so we got to focus a little bit. Do we have any final words on what went wrong for Team Canada here, or was this a situation where this just wasn't the year? There's multiple Canadian eligible players playing in the NHL, which is almost always the case. Did they pick a team poorly? Was it coached poorly? Or was this just not ever going to be their year with the powerhouse USA and Sweden squads?
We see many talk about luck with them, and I think it is a factor. Like, you can't discard it because they lost some pretty big pieces to injuries and illness, and then some pucks didn't go in that maybe they should have had as goals. But yeah, I think it comes down to the strength of their defense, mostly their puck moving game. They couldn't get out of the zone unless Matejchuk and Lamoureux were playing. So if these guys weren't on the ice, they really struggle to make breakouts, and then those breakouts are supposed to lead to controlled zone entries and more offense. They overpassed the puck a bit, but they didn't have any great chances in the slot for long stretches in games too. So it's a bit of everything. I think it's really rarely one factor that leads to an early exit like this. It wasn't their strongest year, just from the crop of players they had to select from in general, but they left some names, some people at home that could have helped, like Owen Pickering. I think it's the main guy who would have made a big difference because he's a breakout master and he has that offensive game and he's big and physical. So that's a bit of a mystery. I didn't have any explanation why he was left off the roster. And I don't know. I think it's a combination of factors. It just wasn't their year. They weren't very lucky. Some personal decision too, and just the way they executed their strategy.
Yeah, and I think hearing the way that Hockey Canada management spoke about the tournament overall after Canada was eliminated, I guess prematurely, they admitted the fact that the 2004 born group has never represented Canada at an international stage. The Holinka Gretzky Cup was canceled, or Canada didn't go during their draft year because of the pandemic. They didn't really have a U18s because the CHL season, the playoffs were delayed to start, so they didn't get the best group of 04s for the 2022 U18s. So for a lot of these players, this is their very first time representing Canada on an international stage, and that's a lot of pressure to put on a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds. And then the other thing is, if they obviously bounces don't go your way, 2 years ago, if Mason McTavish doesn't make that save, Canada doesn't win gold. If Connor Bedard doesn't do what he did last year, against Slovakia in the quarterfinals, Canada goes out in the quarterfinals, maybe potentially. And they didn't have a game breaker this year on their team. And I think, you can take that into account as, bounces don't always go your way. Sometimes the puck is going to deflect off of Oliver Bog and past your goalie with 11 seconds left in a tie game. But if you also only look at that and say like, oh, it just wasn't our year, we'll get them next year. There's a better crop of players coming. I think that's a little bit disingenuous. I think if you had found a way to get line chemistry going, if you had changed up your offensive system and your structure, you may not have found yourself in a tie game with the Czechs in the third period. You know, they're like, if you shoot the puck more on net and you don't overpass 30 times or whatever Scott Salmond ended up saying that they ended up doing, they passed on 30 prime shooting opportunities by his count in that game. So I don't know exactly what he was counting, but that's what he admitted to the media, which I thought was, you know, pretty impressive to that you would, you know, want to admit that maybe your team wasn't as shoot first as they probably should have been in certain scenarios. I think if you only chalk this tournament up to, oh, it was a bad bounce, you know, next year we'll get him, I think that's a little bit disingenuous. I think, you know, if your offensive system is a little bit different, maybe you're up by 3 goals over the Czechs in the third period, and then a bounce goes off Oliver Bonk's leg, and oh, it's only 5-3 at that point, not you lose the game and your tournament's done. So it's one of those things where, yes, like I completely agree with everything David said. Like, you know, it's a little bit of both. Like everything kind of just didn't go Canada's way. They lost a bunch of defensemen before the tournament. Flying players over after you've already taken the team overseas isn't ideal either. Yeah, it was just a kind of a calamity of errors kind of manifested itself into this team's quarterfinal exit.
Yeah, it seems, and also whenever you're coming into a tournament like this and you have one returning player, it's probably not a good sign, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot of players, like you said, Lauren, that haven't had the chance to come up through this program together. We look at like Smith, Perreault, and Leonard, who've played together for what they said 5 years now. Those guys have been playing together. It's easy, like you can develop chemistry, but it's a little bit different when you've had that much time with somebody else or multiple someone else's. It is tough, and I think like a lot of people who are on the outside from Canada, because there's a lot of people in Canada who are like gold or nothing, right? Who might see us talking about this Canada team failing out in the quarterfinals and saying like, oh, they need to improve here, here, here. It's like, I don't think any of us here believe that Canada should win this tournament every year. I think for the tournament to maintain being compelling, for it not to just be a TSN product, there has to be other teams that blow the doors off and take their wins. USA has been knocking at the door and winning golds here and there for a long time now. Sweden perennially knocking at the door and never seems to finally get their gold. You know, Finland has had some great tournaments. Now we've seen Czechia in the top 4 for 3 straight years after having one top 4 finish for, I think it was like 16 years or something like that, or 15 years. It's good to have that, but at the same time, we can't, as people who are looking at this Canadian team, sit back and say, well, you know, win some, you lose some. You do have to criticize when there's things that are done wrong, or poor preparation, or poor coaching. And it's not about, you know, criticizing the young players, but you do have to hold the structures into account, just as part of media, right? That's part of the job. So I think with that said, Team Canada seems to be very interested in being their own enemy a lot of the time. It seems to me like I think two things can be true at once: that Canada brings teams regularly to this tournament that they know are going to cross the line in ways that the IIHF doesn't appreciate. You know, whether it's hitting high or hitting a little bit late, just that extra brand of physical hockey that will get you more penalties. And I think because they have that reputation, there's also an inflationary situation with their penalties, and penalties were a problem this whole tournament, right? For Canada, they were getting themselves in penalty trouble. It's a problem every tournament. Where do you think Canada can go outside of just as simple as saying like bring skill like the USA is doing? What's the path forward for Canada to kind of shake this reputation? Is it just something that Team Canada is stuck with because that's the Canadian identity, or can we move away from that?
Part of the problem I felt like with this team is that they just hadn't played under IIHF officiating before. And I think that's why you saw penalties. Like the geeky hit is a clean hit in the NHL, but in the IIHF, you can't do that. And I think is the little bit of inexperience of playing on an international stage that led to them taking the kind of penalties that we're not used to seeing international teams take. Usually they're a little bit more restrained when it comes to the way they throw their bodies around, the way they, you know, guard players along the boards. That being said, I felt like overall at this tournament, there were so many 5-minute majors called on plays that, you know, were borderline. But then also probably to account for the fact that they wanted to review those penalties and get the plays right. But I felt like there were a lot more ejections this tournament than I think that I can remember seeing. So it could be a product of that. It could be a product of the inexperience. Next year's team should be interesting because they can return a lot of players who will learn from this experience, definitely. And I'm sure they'll be very motivated. Those players who were in the locker room this time for the geeky ejection, for the non-call hit on Owen Beck, like they're going to be better prepared to, I guess, inform or warn their new teammates about, you know, how strictly discipline is handled with the IIHF. And, you know, I guess we'll see what kind of learning experience they can take away from this tournament and bring it into next year. And I trust that the players in that locker room are already ready to go for next year. Like, I'm sure they're ready to take this loss away and get right back to playing, even though it's going to take them another 11 months to get there.
I mean, I want to see how many more years Easton Cowan can play, because he looks about 12. Like, I want to check that birth certificate. I'm not sure. I'm sure he could get a few more than one more after this one. And he was pretty good this year. I thought he was pretty surprisingly good after, you know, so-so year, I guess. But overall, really good for the World Juniors today, or this year. Let's go to the questions a little bit. But before we do, Lauren, I have a question for you to start out, just to feed all the Habs fans who are in the chat now. Owen Beck traded right after this tournament. He's going. Is this a much better trade than last year when he got traded to Peterborough?
Well, I want to say that they haven't finalized the trade yet.
Oh,
like
it's not
Jeff
final.
Merrick. Jeff Merrick had only reported that they were working out a trade with Saginaw. So like, if they can get this trade done, this is the best case scenario for him. Like, I couldn't have picked a better place for him to end up landing. And I thought when Saginaw had initially made a trade for a third line center back in October, I had thought there was no way they were going to have the assets to make a trade of this magnitude, and B, that like there was no way I thought he would end up there. And so for them to have found a way to also add him to their lineup, like, this is probably the strongest Memorial Cup hosting team that we've seen in recent memory. As far as like, I mean, I know Kamloops was stacked last year with Stankoven and Zellweger and Caden Bankier, but this is just one of the most like strong assembled teams, like on paper. Like, you look at the number of NHL draft picks. You got Hunter Hayden, Matthias Shapovalov, who we saw at this tournament, Rodwin Dinicio, NHL draft talent, Zane Parekh, Michael Misa in a couple of years. Like, just from top to bottom, this is a really good team. And if they can finalize this trade and he's off to Saginaw, like, they're the easy Memorial Cup favorites, no matter who ends up winning their respective CHL championships. So yeah, as far as, you know, offense goes, I expect if he ends up there that his numbers should take off. I'm hoping. Saginaw plays a very different system than Peterborough. Peterborough is super restrictive, super safe, passive when it comes to generating offense. Saginaw is just like their players are everywhere on the ice. There's just like the way they can generate offense is pretty impressive. So like, I would hope that his offensive production takes off if he lands there. Yeah, I guess we'll see. I'm very excited to see that this trade finally finalized, because I've been stressed out for the last like 3 weeks that he's going to end up in like London or the Sioux. So
yeah, it's going to be fun, honestly.
All right, I'll direct this one for David. Thanks so much, by the way, Lauren. BC is not actually asking, but is stating, USA hockey better than Canada hockey now, just like for franchises. Obviously, without Bedard there, it's a little bit of a different story. And also Fantelli, I believe, is still eligible. But I know in my mind, USA hockey is catching up. I think if you put a best on best tournament on today, if I'm Canada, I don't think they're going in favorites based on like defense and goaltending. But David, has USA hockey as a developmental program surpassed Canada?
Yes, I think.
Yeah.
In terms of understanding what leads to development. That's the main difference between teams. Like Lauren said earlier, that the Canada coach counted the shots that they missed, and there were 30 of them. That's pretty concerning, because that means he's probably counting every time that they could have put the puck on net, and that's telling about their mentality. When the US, their aim is really to open up the play and try more creative stuff. And you see that at the U17, U18, they just encourage the players to just develop their skills all the time. And a player like Logan Cooley, who's now in the NHL, he wasn't the most skilled player like as a 17-year-old, 18-year-old. You see him like with a large amount of skill now, but he was just trying a lot. And at some point, when you try something that much, you get better at it. But that's the main recipe for development for everyone in everything. And it works the same in hockey. So when you give freedom to their player, you make them play together and develop their creativity. At some point, they just exceed their potential. They increase it. And I think Canada has some really great players. They just still develop a lot of talent, and you see Connor Bedard and all of this. We have that culture of hockey, but in terms of understanding development and what leads to development and applying it in a system, the US is catching up. I think in terms of overall talent, maybe Canada is still ahead a bit, but they're going to get surpassed unless they change their mentality and find a way to really open up the play and let players really work in a better strategy, and they select their best players to play in tournament and make them play together. So there's a bunch of things you can do. So in a way, yes, they're really catching up fast.
Yeah, I feel like what you were mentioning there, it reminds me, there's a quote that goes around once in a while. It's usually about art, right? It's about like art isn't a skill, it's just being able to play, right? It's like that's how you actually develop yourself in certain ways. And the same is true of sports, right? There is skill involved, obviously, but the way skill starts for most people, there are some people who are naturally just, machines at whatever sport. But for most people, it is just having that chance to play around and figure out what works for them, what they're able to do that's special that maybe somebody else can't do or most people can't do. And that is a thing that with rigid style development gets lost, right? And it seems like the USA is better at allowing their players to develop those skills than Canada is right now overall. And I will say, it seems like Team USA has like a strategy that they prefer, not just across men's teams, but women's teams as well. I feel like both the men and women for USA hockey, it's all about like speed in transition. It's like you're getting that puck and you're going up the ice as fast as possible, and you're going to create problems that way off the rush all the time. And it's very successful. Frankly, it is very successful.
Yeah, the goal that Isaac Howard scored, like it's the same type of goal that he scored all the time at the U18 level. Like he would just speed past the defender, catch him off guard. It was Tom Willander, I think, and that play, and he just got the puck and went to the net. Like he scored that same type of play. So it's all speed, getting ahead of the puck, and beating the opposition in transition. That's part of it. But when you're in the offensive zone, it's about using the top of the zone, creating plays that way. You see Canada do it too, but the US has it really ingrained in their strategy. It's natural, it's instinctive for them. So it's a small difference, but it matters in games like this.
100%. And I don't know if either of you guys are big watchers of the Swedish Hockey League, but there's a comment here from Nicholas Lund that says, can the Habs get his team to trade Engstrom to a team that also wants him in the same way that Beck is now wanted by Saginaw? Apparently Engstrom is not wanted. I thought he was playing on the first pair out there in Sweden.
Yeah, I thought he was playing a lot. I can check.
I mean, we can definitely check on it. I don't know if the Canadians are going to force a trade in Sweden.
No, they don't have that kind of influence. Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah, that's a bit much to ask. Like junior teams, maybe you could muscle around a little bit, but that's a professional league, right? It's a little bit tougher to do that, especially when eventually you're going to steal that player from them anyway, right? So
he's still playing around 20 minutes, so that's pretty good for a young player. Like he's not on every shift like Lane Hudson, but in a pro league, it's pretty normal for someone his age to get that kind of ice time. It's even above average.
For sure. Trinka 2.0 asks, can the Habs draft Michael Misa and then they'd have Misa, Meshar, and Misak? Announcers would hate them.
You can add to that, they should trade for Martin Misiak from Chicago.
Oh my god. Who was the guy? I forget which team he was on. I think he was an Alan Walsh client that just had like his first name and last name. Was it Marcel?
Oh yeah, Marcel
just two, right?
Or Ivan.
Ivan was the other one too. I love it. Get all the most confusing names and put them on one team, and I will root for that team every single time. Like I've been pushing, like I see that he's actually developing now a little bit after being a bit of a long shot for a long time, but Jet Wu, I want him in the NHL so bad. I want him to be awesome. Because like, imagine your name is Jet Wu and he has to play for the Jets. Like, just get him on the Jets.
Yeah, he needs. I think he's from Winnipeg. Am I not mistaken?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he's from Winnipeg, and his name is Jet. Like, he needs to be on that team.
If Gary Bettman stepped in and made an executive decision that he had to transfer that contract to the Jets, nobody should be upset. It should be legally allowed. Just no trade. Just it's happening. Let's see if we have any other questions here. Trinka says we need Owen Beck hype level excitement again. Give us the serotonin. I mean, we did talk about Beck, but should we talk about where is he as a prospect right now? Is he like, do you see him as strong as like at draft day, or is he kind of like leveled off a little bit?
I feel like my hype excitement is waning slightly because the longer they drag this trade out, the more stressed I get that something's going to happen. He's going to end up in the Sioux. But it's not that would be a bad place for him. I'm just like, now that the back to Saginaw idea has been planted in my head, like that's the only place I want him to end up. Yeah, I mean, obviously I think we saw it really reflected in this tournament exactly what Beck is going to be in the NHL. A solid third line center, defensive zone starts, PK, probably not as much of an offensive opportunity as he's going to get in the rest of his junior career.
Right.
But he played well enough, like the off puck positioning, the winning the little one-on-one battles. He played well enough to kind of basically like, this is the Habs third line center of the future, at least in my opinion. Like, I think, once Stock is healthy, behind him and Suzuki, like, I think you could easily pencil him into next year's lineup if he can prove his way in training camp. Like, I don't think the projection has changed in the slightest. I think the possibility that his upside was as high as second line center was maybe a little bit of a stretch at the time. The offense has kind of dipped a little bit since he joined Peterborough, and if he can find a different gear with his new team wherever he ends up landing, because it sounds like he's getting traded no matter what, then obviously that opens the door again for maybe his ceiling to be potentially a little bit higher than third line center upside. But yeah, I mean, like, this was his projection heading into the draft, and this is still his projection now. I don't think he's done anything to suggest that he won't be a successful third line center in the NHL.
Yeah, 100%. Amy P says, what will the announcers do when Vancouver gets their second Elias Pettersson? Great question. It's going to be tough. They're going to have to just call the number, right? They have to, because you can't do E. Peterson on the back of the jersey either. Like, what's the point?
One is like original PD and younger PD. I don't know. Defenseman PD and forward PD.
There you go. F and D. Jean Simard asks, we're going to go for both. He's asking Lauren specifically, but can Lauren sell us on her favorite OHL player for the 2024? Oh, she's saying OHL draft. I'm guessing you mean NHL draft. And then David, you can give us your favorite player, whoever it is. It's maybe like you rank higher than other people for the 2024 draft, and then we'll close it out.
Okay, so I guess I'll start. David has heard me talk about this player enough this season because I won't shut up about him in Slack. But Luke Misa, Michael's older brother, is draft eligible this year. He is currently the Mississauga Steelheads first line center. So I guess you could say I have a thing for whatever is going on in Mississauga and their centers. But he's a super good rush transition, super fast, super speedy, a little bit undersized at 5'10", I think he's at. Just the offensive instincts, the ability to shape players, kind of create space for himself. Very impressive at this age, especially a player who is undersized. I just really love the game that he plays. He's defensively aware, responsible, heavy on back checks, stick lifts at the right times, well positioned, kind of plays like super consistently at both ends of the ice. And the other guy I really like in Saginaw, I've already mentioned him, is Zane Parekh. Super fun, dynamic offensive defenseman who can create magic in the offensive zone. Defense has shown some improvement this year. It's obviously not as consistent as you would ideally like it to be by the time he gets to the NHL, but given that he's shown some improvement this year compared to last year, I'm willing to think it's going to continue to keep improving as long as he puts in the attention to detail, and that sort of thing. But the super dynamic offensively, super fun to watch.
All right,
Yeah,
David.
mine would be Ryder Ritchie. He's flying a bit under the radar right now. We have him at 9. He's probably going to fall on the next board because he was scoring a lot. Now he's scoring less than a point per game, and that's always a red flag for a draft eligible forward. And he's injured right now. The thing to keep in mind with him is that he's playing not in the best situation right now in Prince Albert. He doesn't have a lot of offensive support, and he's a player who loves to make highlight reel plays. So he forces a lot of passes, forces a lot of dangles, but his skill level is really, really high. Doesn't show up every game. He's very inconsistent. And I think he's going to fall on draft day a bit. But he's someone you should keep in the back of your mind when you look at the draft as someone who could fall maybe in the 20s. We'll see, depending on his injury, who could be a real steal down the line because the skill level is very high and he has that try everything mentality that's needed for development. So I really like him. Unfortunately, it's going to be hard to keep him high because of the injury, because of the production, but he's someone to keep an eye on.
There you go. 2 players to pay attention to in the upcoming draft. I like the idea of a guy who's like not quite figured it out and he's gonna fall, and that's the kind of guy that you want in like the mid first round that maybe you steal, right?
Yeah.
All right, folks. Thanks so much for tuning in on this show in general. We hope to bring it back next year in the same or similar format with Elite Prospects. It's been fantastic dealing with our amazing scouts from there and our great hosts at SDPN. So for Game Over Juniors 2024, make sure you check the description on this podcast if you're listening on a podcast, or this YouTube video if you're watching on YouTube, and follow David and Lauren everywhere